You have to recognize that every great content strategy, whether it's for an individual or for a business, is invariably defined by one priority platform. If you're paying an agency like 50 hours a month and you're asking them to manage like 6 different channels, it's failed before it's begun. And then you basically need to execute like a maniac, and it's all about execution.
You see people go through phases on LinkedIn, post a load of stuff, get nowhere, and then they're just quiet, don't post anything again.
There are certain brands that absolutely have a higher purpose, and that is fantastic, but you don't need it. If you don't have it, don't pretend that you have it. And if you do want it, then be real about how that's going to happen. So for example,
I've seen some cartoons on LinkedIn. You've had a lot of success in terms of posting. Where did that all begin? What is that comic strip?
I published in the past on LinkedIn and got 7 likes, including my dad and a couple of my mates and my colleagues, and just packaging it up in a way that was more playful. And I shared them with one of our graphic designers. She was like, I think you should just like embrace the shit. I think you should just like, that should be your thing.
Paid now in Google is just a minefield, and you can very quickly almost set fire to money.
Google always existed to give people the best results from the most trusted brands. It just wasn't terribly good at doing it back when I started. Don't set yourself up for failure. Don't say you're going to do this thing like 3 times a week if it's not going to happen. Like if you think you can do it twice a week, say you'll do it once a week and never ever miss it. That consistency is everything. As long as you are seeing the progress at an engagement level, this is a much longer term journey. Until you've defined your core competencies and demonstrated that you can deliver on them 365 days a year, then frankly, who gives a shit like what your lofty, abstract, bullshit, made-up vision says on your website?
And that's the soundbite, kids. So, thanks for coming on the Game Changers podcast, Dan. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thank you ever so much for having me here, guys. So I'm Dan Holt. I run an agency called Boss Digital. We've been going about 12 years now, which is always depresses me slightly when I think of that, but I guess it's something that we should be proud of, but just amazing how quickly time goes. We focus principally on sort of B2B, but we also have kind of accidentally got into quite a lot of health and fitness and charity work as well. So those are our sort of different spaces, really.
And how did you sort of get into that industry? And
I was keen to start a company. I'd been involved as a director of a previous company, and following some tricky experiences, I was keen to have my own opportunity to, in a sense, I guess, like design my own organisational culture, but not really knowing much about anything. I didn't have an obvious place to begin with what that company should be. So I'd done about 10 minutes in marketing. So I thought, well, you know, that's as good a place as any to kick off. I think if I'd realized at the time just what a tit I was going to make out of myself for the first 2, maybe 3 years, I never would have had the audacity to have done it. But thankfully I didn't. So I sort of stumbled through the first few years. And as I say, now sort of 10, 12 years on, everything's in pretty good shape. But yeah, that's how it began.
And you mentioned there an important thing about culture. In terms of that building culture, and I'm sure we'll come on to this later on in the questions, but what were the kind of things that you were striving to build that you couldn't when you were working for someone else in another business?
And the first thing to say is like the world has changed a bit. So when I look back to my really early experiences at work, I recognise that the world was a slightly different place. So maybe it isn't a kind of fair comparison, but there were certain things that took place that I didn't really feel comfortable with. And I just felt in certain respects, I think maybe the thing that bothered me the most was an excessive tolerance for high performers that were also arseholes. And I just think that's one of the core things. I think it's so easy to be overly flexible with people who basically, they deliver a commercial result for the business and therefore you make every excuse about their behavior in the workplace. And that was one of the things that frustrated me. I was fascinated by how you build a team and get the best out of people, how you motivate people, how you sort of tap into their strengths, etc. So I just was fascinated by the whole thing. I probably didn't realize how difficult it was. I think it's very easy to judge and criticize when you've not tried to do it yourself. But yeah, that was a big learning curve.
Yeah, that high performing bad apple thing is really difficult to come to terms with, but it's important. You're right, because that bad apple, even though they're a high performer, will spoil the rest of them, and you will end up with leavers and churn as a result of that individual. In terms of, obviously, you mentioned fitness and sort of the charitable work that you get involved with. What drew you to those particular sectors in terms of your focus?
So I think the health and fitness one was a bit by accident. We had a couple of clients in the gym sector that just were fantastic case studies, and they led to lots of other work in the health and fitness market, then working with nutrition brands and fit tech brands, etc. I think the charity one was a little bit more intentional, bit of a generalization, but you tend to find quite a lot of nice people working in charities, and we had some lovely relationships, and we just found that when they went from one charity to another, they very often took us with them. So yeah, they're nice spaces, but it's very different from the work that we do in B2B, and we've tried to now kind of separate the different parts of the business to ensure that we've got the right people sort of operating within each of those teams.
And in terms of that structure, can you walk me through from a high level, like the structure? Have you got separate teams by sector? How do you align your people around your target clients?
I'm a really big advocate of like sector specialism, which is, ironically, marketing agencies aren't terribly good at positioning themselves. And I was involved in some research years ago where we surveyed a large number of business owners and asked them to rank the different traits, the different characteristics that they would look for in a service provider. And I can't remember them all, but there were things like, trustworthiness, expertise, price, partner-led service, blah, blah, blah. Yep. The two that by an order of magnitude came out on top were commercialism and sector expertise. In other words, like, do they know our world? Do they talk our language, etc.? Do they know what our competitors are up to? For a long time, we've tried to develop that, but it's been quite hard because I think fundamentally you have to make sure that at your core, you are delivering really good work irrespective of the domain. So we initially, I was kind of obsessed with, right, how do we build those core competencies? And then I think we kind of moved on to the next layer, which was then more about building sector-specific teams. So we have a sector-agnostic operations team, and then we're building these kind of pods around that, one for health and fitness, one for B2B, and then the charity is a bit of a sort of hybrid between the two.
I suppose as a result of that, you sort of ended up talking their client's language, which always makes that sort of sales engagement process a little bit easier.
Marketing is not difficult, but it requires work, and the information is generally out there. And actually, if you understand what the best brands, the most successful brands are doing in that particular space, where they're spending their money, where they're generating their traffic, where they're engaging with their audience, etc., there is very real value to that intelligence, to that insight. So I think it helps from a sales perspective because, of course, it's reassuring to the customer that you can talk their language. But I actually think at a operational level that there's real substance to it as well. I think if you understand the mechanics, you just know. Of course, there's like a layer of creativity that needs to sit on top of that is unique to that particular brand. Yep. But under the bonnet, there is something very particular about most industries.
Yep. No, absolutely. We see that with like legal sector and insurance and financial services. So it's massive in terms of being relevant to those clients. In terms of the back end of the business, what innovation have you got behind the scenes that's really helping you grow and set yourself apart?
I think innovation is an interesting thing, right? Because everyone's obviously, like every company now is supposedly, an innovative organization, and most sets of values will contain the word innovation somewhere. If we're honest, most of it's bollocks. Like we were talking about Rory Sutherland earlier, and he's got this lovely quote where he says to the effect of, innovation is leaving room for ideas that don't make sense. In other words, if you follow the path of like rationality, you just end up in the same place as everyone else, and that's the opposite of innovation.
Yep.
And I think that you have to be very, very deliberate about it. I think the key words there in that quote are leaving room for, or leaving space for, and that means either time or having dedicated people or teams for that innovation work. So we have certain mechanics in place or mechanisms in place where, for example, at the end of each month, we will sit down as a team, and each person will have to say, this is specifically how I've used ChatGPT or whatever the kind of the tool is to do something better or faster or more efficiently in my role. But I feel like we have to take it a lot further. I feel like our next step is we need someone who's specifically owning that and championing that within the organization. There's a general focus within Boss on that, as there is in most companies. I think probably our only real example of going a step further recently has been we've developed, for want of a better description, a dashboard that essentially captures the entire marketing process from market research, brand strategy, content strategy, every imaginable channel activity, analytics, analysis. We have a dashboard that captures about 200 and 250 different components to that process. It's just, I guess it's like the digital representation of my brain, because I think in quite like an analytical, structured way, and it stresses me out how ambiguous most marketers are about their definitions and their processes.
Yep. So
we have this dashboard, and we have recently started using like a spreadsheet integration for ChatGPT. So theoretically, a CMO or a business owner could answer about a dozen questions relating to their business and their market, and it would populate the entire thing, from all the market research, the brand, the vision statement, the values, the color palette, the typeface, content strategies, channel activity, priority channels, the priority metrics they should be tracking, etc. And it's not really with a view to sell it as a product, but it's more to illustrate what I think is quite a comprehensive and systematic approach to marketing that we have at Boss. So I would say, that might be an example of something that we're doing a bit differently.
Yeah, interesting. So I heard a story in another podcast about, I think it might have been P.T. Barnum that we know for like circus, that type of stuff. But at P.T. Barnum, I think Otis Elevators, they weren't selling many elevators. Something like, say they were selling 100 elevators a year, and people just weren't buying elevators because they built this great technology to make elevators safe, but no one knew about it. And they decided to do this practical demonstration. They went somewhere, rented out this space, and they had this elevator installed, and he was like stood on top of it, and his assistant chopped through the cables. And he said, right, chop through the rest of them. And then literally the elevator falls about 2 feet and comes to a stop. And before you knew it, like the year after, he sold 2,000 elevators and 3,000. And now you routinely see Otis elevators. And that practical demonstration that you've got there of that, this is the dashboard that shows the secret sauce, is it gives people that tangible of like, this is what it's going to do for me. I can see it now. I can bring it to life.
Yeah, I think so. So we're pretty close to that, and I'm probably more excited about it than I really should be. We'll see what it actually comes to, but I think if nothing else, it's a way, as I said, of illustrating our approach, and also I think with internal people when they join the company, like as I say, it is the kind of digital kind of personification of me in a sense, and the way that my brain works and the way that I look at how you create marketing strategies. So I think operationally it's been quite useful as well. And I think as much as anything, it's important to have a project that forces you to make use of these tools, because otherwise, if you're only ever playing with them in the abstract, I think it's difficult to really understand, the kind of practicalities.
Yeah, absolutely. What does being a game changer mean to you?
I think in reality, these things are usually the aggregation of a million marginal gains than they are, one silver bullet. I feel like it's really a question of consistent execution over time.
Yep.
Whether that's, if I look at the best marketers, it's not that they necessarily have one thing, but they are someone who has very deliberately chosen their path and then carved out, 30 minutes a day for the first 3 to 5 years of their career to learn about stuff within that very particular discipline. And that sounds like a really simple thing, but that immediately puts them in a very special club, because basically most marketers are quite lazy people.
Yep.
So whether it's that or, the same would be true of any content strategy. The idea is the simple thing. It's about the consistent execution over a long period of time that ultimately separates this content strategy from the 99 that never made it. So I think, as with most things, it's about lots of marginal gains and relentless execution.
We have an internal saying, which is the compound effect of small matters. And it's true, like those marginal gains that you find, even to a certain extent, like the basics. A lot of firms don't do the basics. They skip to the shiny stuff, they miss the basics. And some of those can be where we as a sort of like find the marginal gains to be had. So what advice would you give to your past self when starting out?
I think work in a couple of big agencies, and I guess the same would be true whatever kind of field you go into. The marketing industry is basically full of cowboys, and I was one of those cowboys without realizing it for a long time. Like, you don't really need qualifications to go into it. There's no real kind of formal framework, and that's fine. Like, creativity is too subjective a thing to reduce to one blueprint. It's just so vague. And I think if I'd worked in a couple of big agencies, first of all, I probably could have accelerated our development. I probably could have taken the 10 years and shrunk it down to about 2 or 3. Of course, the problem is they wouldn't have hired me. So ironically, my only avenue in a sense was to start my own agency. But I think that would have been the better route.
So I've seen some cartoons on LinkedIn. And I know you've had a lot of success in terms of posting cartoons on LinkedIn. Where did that all begin, and like what is that comic strip, and how did it come about, and how's it helped you?
I can't really remember how it came about. It was I think last December. It was around Christmas time that I published the first one, and I was keen. Obviously, there's just so much content, and one of the nice things about being in B2B, which includes us as an agency targeting our clients, generally these are quite creatively malnourished spaces, and a little bit of imagination and ambition goes a disproportionately long way relative to most consumer markets. So I was just keen to find a more playful kind of consumer way of taking the insight that I may have published in the past on LinkedIn and got 7 likes, including, my dad and a couple of my mates and my colleagues, and just packaging it up in a way that was more playful. And so I started doodling, and I'm almost so within our team, I'm kind of well known for being the least artistically talented. Like there's like a running joke. If we do any like team games that involve putting pen to paper, everyone's just like waiting to see what crap I end up with.
Sounds like me.
And I created these little doodles, and I shared them with one of our graphic designers. And I was like, can you give me some feedback? And if you think there's something in this, then I'd really appreciate it if you help me with them. And she was like, I think you should just like embrace the shitness. I think you should just like, that should be your thing.
Yeah.
Like they're so bad, but maybe lean into that. So that's what we did. And it really is like, I can say exactly the same thing as I say in one of those Mary cartoons, like just in a regular text update, and like nobody cares. But like I stick it, into Mary, and suddenly, people are interested.
And what do you think it is about that specific character, and that, is it the carousel nature of it? Is it the fact that it's got that extra bit of creativity that other people aren't doing, that it's taking a risk? What is it that's paying off, do you think, in terms of that hook?
Well, I think story is everything, right? Yeah. So that's the first thing. It's I don't know if I'm creative enough to, like, I look at some people and they do such a broad variety of creative things, and I'm like, I don't know if I have that. Like, I need more of a kind of formula around me, and that's what Mary gives me. Like the opening slide is always the same, and like I kind of always know where it goes, and it gives me clear like tram lines, right? And I find that very reassuring. It means I create the scripts in like 20 minutes because it's like I feel comfortable within that. Whereas if it was just a blank canvas, I'd find it very difficult. But I think one of the things it does is it forces it to be a story. And I think at the moment that you set something up in that kind of story narrative, it's just more engaging for people.
Do you think sometimes people are bought into the journey to see what comes next, almost, in a way?
I'd like to think so. I think there are those people. Yeah, I think they're waiting for Mary to 3D print a Kalashnikov and to go all out. But yeah, I think more than anything, it's an easier, lighter way of consuming what would otherwise be quite heavy content.
Absolutely. And it was the choice in name for Mary. Did that come from anywhere, or was it just I
wanted quite no offense to any Marys, but I wanted basically like
you wanted to be a basic name,
like quite a bland name.
Yeah.
Because I wanted it to be like the opposite of what you'd expect in like a digital function. Do you know what I mean? Like I didn't want it to sound young. I wanted it to sound kind of like grown up and a bit sensible, and I guess I like alliteration. So.
And in terms of like the storytelling behind Mary, where do the experiences come from that you kind of translate into these shit cartoons?
Yeah, it's funny actually, because I've got certain clients that will often message me and be like, God, that Mary this morning, was that about me? Like, honestly. I think they're like pretty universal issues. So I think like I often see myself in like Brian, who's basically like, he's the bad guy, right? But I'm like, if I'm honest, I probably see like things that I've done more. I often see him more in myself.
The CEO one, is that me that's referring
exactly.
to? It's up to these guys.
So I think they're really like universal traits, very easy to fall into. And I think hopefully, every team needs its Mary, just to kind of call out that bullshit. But they're really, really common mistakes. So I'm not trying to like, when one of my clients be like, Dan, seriously, that was actually about us, wasn't it? Because basically that exact thing, we had that conversation 3 weeks ago. And I'll just try and be like, look, like these are totally normal things. Like these are like, they apply to us, they apply to everybody. So yeah, I don't think there's any kind of shame in being guilty of those things, but you need a Mary just to kind of call it out sometimes.
Yeah, and I suppose it's been identifying those things, those sort of threads that run through every environment and just going a bit more blunt on the nose with it. And that's what's probably giving it that virality.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you drop an F-bomb and you probably get another 10 likes.
What stage did you reach where you were like, actually, we should post this on LinkedIn? What inspired you to start the Doodles? Was it almost accidental?
No, so it was quite intentional. I knew I wanted to do something, but there's this brilliant blog called Wait But Why. I don't know if you've ever read it. It's the best blog in the world by a guy called Tim Urban, and he does these, I mean, the blogs are insanely long, they'll be like 5,000 words, but he does these terrible cartoons along with them. And I think if there was like an inspiration for it, like that was probably it.
Yep.
But I don't think he's ever been on LinkedIn, and I think LinkedIn was just an obvious place for me to kind of focus them, plus also carousels generally do quite well.
Yeah.
So it was more kind of by accident really. I'll create 5, I'll post them, I'll try not to worry too much because I'm quite an anxious person and I worry too much about like what people will think. So I'm like, this is going to be embarrassing, but I'm just going to do it. And then if they get more than my average posts do, which is such a low bar, then I'll persevere. And the first kind of half dozen did pretty well. So I was like, well, I'll carry on. And then I had a couple soon after that just went crazy. And I just kind of quite enjoyed doing it. And I think that's really important. I think whatever content, because it's organic content strategy is like an 18-month game, right? Like minimum to see consistent commercial results, right?
Yeah.
You might see some like progress in vanity metrics before then, but it is a long-term journey. So if you're not enjoying it, I think that is such a big problem. And very early on, I was like, I quite enjoy this. So that's a pretty good sign.
Yeah, it's a long old slog when you're having to produce content to deliver sort of business growth and opportunities that come in. I mean, in terms of that, how have you found, I know it's obviously that's still quite early, but how have you found lead generation off the back of the cartoons that you've produced?
The way that I came into it was very much as I've just said there. Like when you look at any content strategy, there's like a number of universal principles, right? So you need to be really clear on what your angle is, unless you're operating in a really niche market. So what's that sort of defining characteristic that distinguishes it from everything else? You need to be really clear on the format, really, really clear on the channel. And then you basically need to execute like a maniac, never, ever missing a beat for like, as I say, probably 18 months before you're consistently seeing those commercial returns. And when you look at all the great, if you got like 100 great content strategies, those are the principles that tie them all together, irrespective of what platform they're on. So I went into it being like, I'm not going to judge it on anything other than just kind of, am I enjoying it? And am I seeing some progress in like engagement, etc. We have had a number of leads come through, and it's amazing now, like how often people will just like, I wouldn't even realize that they will have seen it, and then they'll just randomly bring up in a conversation, like once they're already a client, like I really enjoyed that Mary post like from 6 months ago or whatever. So there's something there, but I keep trying to remind myself that I'm only 9 months in, and just as I would advise any client, don't judge it at this stage. As long as you are seeing the progress at an engagement level, like this is a much longer term journey.
Yeah, because that attribution gets really hard to measure. Because we say this, like we're like, oh, well, someone's come to us about being a client, and it's only sometimes after you get them on board, they go, oh yeah, we saw your YouTube videos, or we saw this, or we saw that. But also sometimes that might be like almost subliminal. Like they've seen it. It's reinforcing that conversation they're currently having with you, positioning you as the experts, and this down-to-earth team of people that know and get it and understand it.
Yeah.
And that's, sometimes that's really hard to track.
Really hard. I mean, I saw someone the other day call it dark attribution. I think it's more commonly referred to as like dark social, although I would just call it brand, right? Like brand is like fundamentally, you just can't track the overwhelming majority of it. And I think now in this digital world, because we kind of bought into this idea about 10, 15 years ago that everything was trackable. Now when you can't track something, we feel like we need to give a name to that thing. So we call it dark social or dark attribution. Yeah. It's just brand. And it's so, again, quoting Rory Sutherland, like how do you, for example, maybe it affects your recruitment process or one of his lovely quotes, how do you value the ability to be able to get your phone calls answered by like senior decision makers, right? So like sometimes being indiscriminately famous is you can't put a price on it. You can't directly say, well, this happened because of that. But there's just this general, life just gets a little bit easier when you are more broadly known among your target markets.
Yeah, those doors become a little bit easier to open, those conversations a little easier to be had. And there's a saying is people don't necessarily buy the best product, they buy the best known product.
Exactly. Because brand is essentially a risk mitigator, right?
Yeah.
You're not buying it because, as you say, you think it's the best, but because there's like, it's less likely it's going to be terrible. And if you see this company investing in this content strategy and they're popping up in places and they're demonstrating their expertise, that hygiene factor element of like, they're probably not dickheads or cowboys, you feel like that's been ticked off.
So LinkedIn, probably like 3 to 5 years ago now, was acquired by Microsoft. What shifts have you seen in the platform since that happened? And how have they impacted your work on LinkedIn, either internally or with your clients?
Personally, I've only been really active on LinkedIn, I would say, for a couple of years. As an agency, we were very, very search orientated for like our first probably 7 years or so. So it would be difficult for me to say this has been the kind of the evolution that LinkedIn's gone over the last 5 years. I think there are a few things that everyone would agree, which is that it's definitely become a lot more like other social platforms in that it's a place to build real relationships. And I think a lot of the kind of the corporate bullshit has kind of fallen away as people have seen that actually, you know, massive cliche, but people buy from people. So actually you need to build real relationships in a much more authentic way, and using humor and being a bit self-deprecating or sharing, you know, pictures of your dog or whatever it is, like it or not, those things, they just are a lot more effective than very, very dry corporate content. So I think there's been quite a big shift, even in the last like 18 months, 2 years, in that regard. I think there's definitely a move now towards more like pay to play. I think it's a natural evolution for any social platform that they obviously begin with a big focus on like organic reach, like maximizing organic reach and engagement, so that they maximize the number of active users, and then they shift the focus onto paid promotion. I think we're just starting to see that now. I think with like the thought leadership ads and that sort of thing. So having said that, I still think it's a really, really good time to be focused on LinkedIn. Whilst there's always that temptation to assume that you're kind of too late to the party and that you're waiting, what's the next big platform, the next TikTok going to be? I think LinkedIn, actually it's been around a bloody long time, and I think it is the corporate space to be the business space from a social media point of view. And I think that absolutely, when I'm advising our B2B clients now, basically I would say search, email and LinkedIn would be like 9 times out of 10, they would be the kind of priority channels.
And how do you think the shift with like Gen Z workers will affect how people market to their audience, particularly on things like TikTok, etc.?
So in terms of what's engaging with a younger audience?
So I guess as that sort of Gen Z audience works up through the ranks within your target prospects, is going to pretend they'll potentially be in more senior or decision making or influencer positions. And how do you think that will shift as those platforms and more so those users evolve?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you just got to remind yourself that these people, it's all they've ever known, right? So like even if I'm in my late 20s now, which sadly I'm not, I've not known a time, and I might be like a marketing manager, I've not known a time where social media wasn't a thing. So it's so fundamental. A big thing obviously is the tone with which we communicate. And I think there is still, within the corporate world, there is a real reluctance, particularly among bigger, more established brands, a real reluctance to just kind of let themselves go a little bit and just be more kind of human. And it's crazy. It's absolutely, like, I do get it. But like it continues to hold back so many big brands. Even I was like, probably the first time I swore on LinkedIn. I was a little bit like, no, what am I doing? Or like, obviously the Mary cartoons, I felt totally ridiculous. But the fact is, people, whether wearing a suit and tie or whether they're, people are just people, and ultimately they connect with emotion, they connect with story, and that's true whether they're 20 or 50, whether they're in the office or whether they're at home on the weekend. It's always true. So I just think brands need to get past that.
I personally really like what Ryanair do. I think their socials, I think there's some people like Twitter. It's maybe on TikTok, I don't know. I don't go on that very often. But they basically take the piss out of people that call them out. And I think like there's a lot of work must go into that. And it comes across really, really well and quite funny. Yeah. And I see it and I laugh and I think, oh, there you go. They've got back in my brain for free there now. When I'm thinking about flying again, I'll be like, oh, Ryanair.
Yeah, because you're never going to not think that they're basically charlatans, right? Like you kind of like we all sort of hate Ryanair, right? That's not going to change. Yeah. So again, you either kind of embrace that and lean into that and make that a strength, and or you kind of pretend it doesn't exist. Like so I just think I think they're a fantastic example, Ryanair.
So we've had this discussion internally, and we know you've got an episode on Mary's Marketing Adventures and ChatGPT versus copywriters. And I think it's a pretty common issue that I'm sure lots of firms are going through. Where do you think where does that go in the future? How does it look? How does ChatGPT influence copywriting? And, will it replace all that low level junk content that people end up writing on their websites? What does that look like?
For me, copy is everything, right? So like if I have a skill, then it would be as a copywriter, rather than I'd never identify as like, a social media guy or like an email guy or anything like that. And I just think no matter what the channel or tactic, everything ultimately comes down to words. It always has. I don't care, even if we're talking about a YouTube video, it's still like, who wrote the script, right? Like everything at some level is words. For that reason, like a lot of people, was quite anxious when ChatGPT came out, because I was like, this is everything, and it's just like, it's gone. And then I was quite quickly reassured. I don't really think anyone knows where that's going to go, but I think for the time being, so by definition, all ChatGPT does is regurgitate what already exists, right? Like literally that's all it can do. It's just an aggregator of existing information. So I don't think there's too much to worry about in that respect at the moment. I've not seen any example of like true creativity from ChatGPT. I just don't think that's what it's for fundamentally as a tool. So and exactly the same exists with the various design tools. So I think the question is like, do you actually have something to say? Because if you don't, and sadly most marketers don't, right? Like most copywriters, they did like an English degree at university, so they think they'd be a copywriter. Or like most designers, well, it's because they're half decent on Photoshop or blah, blah, blah. Those people need to be worried, right? Because there are tools that can do the thing that they're doing. Yeah. But if you actually have something to say that doesn't currently exist in the world, then these are just tools that can help you say it, more efficiently at scale, blah, blah, blah. So, there are definitely some very specific applications. So, for example, from like a search perspective, the ability to take a page of content and spin that into 20 different pages with unique content so it gets indexed, etc. There are some very like specific applications that, are really exciting, really genuinely very useful. But fundamentally, it is not going to make a bad copywriter a good copywriter. So I don't think there's too much to worry about at the moment, but I think we all need to be very careful about predicting what comes next.
I think it's probably at its peak at the moment until we see some actual improvement upon like how it's being used. So in the technology space, we've seen Copilot, which is this Microsoft new product that's going to come along and it gets added to your Word, your PowerPoint, your Power BI, and you'll be able to ask it to summarize this conversation I had with so-and-so over email and turn it into a PowerPoint, for example. And it'll go and actually do that for you. But there's been a bit of an uproar because they just announced the pricing. So Microsoft's Office 365 licenses, I think it's about it's all in dollars, so let's keep it in dollars. It's probably about $20 a month, let's say, for their Office 365 license. They've come along and said this add-on for Copilot, effectively ChatGPT, is $30 a month extra. And currently you can only buy 300 licenses at a time per month. So it's $9,000 a month minimum. And I think we're going to start to see a lot of this where it'll have an intrinsic value to businesses where they'll pay for it, because if genuinely that can make them more productive, people will be prepared to pay for that, because if you can save your designers, I mean, we've been using generative fill on stuff to like make our life a little bit easier. If you can start to save time, there'll start to be an ROI to it, and that's when it starts to get a little bit more interesting.
Yeah.
And I think given that increase in price in the next like 3 to 6 months, we'll start to see this from Microsoft. It'll be led by is this idea that this is the ROI for having these AI tools and how they can make you more efficient, more productive. And I think from what we've seen, a lot of those lower end jobs that do a lot of like automated data processing, those are the things that are really at risk.
Yeah. So automation up until like now, like I would say it's always within those more structured environments where the application is more obvious and more robust.
Yep.
I think with ChatGPT, there was for a period this like excitement / concern that like it was going beyond that, and it was like true creativity that was being replaced.
Yeah.
It absolutely, that is 100% not the case. I'm not saying it won't be the case, but as of today, 100% isn't. So I think you're right. Like it is, whether it's a marketing function, finance function, whatever, can you identify those tasks that are highly repeatable, highly structured, etc., and there has to then be an automation solution to that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Do you think that Mary's marketing adventures have influenced others to push for change in their internal organisation based on the dilemmas of the comics?
Oh God, I don't know. I think maybe we're a bit early for that. I'm always amazed. I get quite a few messages on LinkedIn, just like personal messages, just being like, "Thanks so much for this," and you wouldn't believe the big thing that happened to me yesterday, and it's exactly X, Y, Z. You know, these people really do exist, and isn't it crazy? And blah blah blah.
Yeah.
That's obviously really lovely to hear, and so I don't know. I think maybe people can use it as a way of like reassuring themselves that they're like not alone, and that there are Brians in every marketing function. And as I said, probably one of them sat right here, sadly. But yeah.
So Mary's episode about purpose is one that many business owners will take something away from. How do you suggest that companies understand their what and not just their why?
Yeah, it's interesting this. I feel like Simon Sinek has a lot to answer for with that video. Like, I mean, he's definitely communicated the idea of vision and purpose more effectively than anybody else, which is why it's got to be one of the most successful TED business talks.
Absolutely. I hear it repeated all the time.
Yeah, but what kills me is it's always the same. You look at their like the page on the website with like the vision statement, and it will literally be like, "We exist to challenge the status quo in our market." I'm like, no, you fucking don't. Like, you exist to conform to the
You've
status
watched a
quo
TED video
and maybe make a bit of money, right? Yeah. Like that's what you exist to do. Like, just be honest about it, and it's okay. I'm not saying there are certain brands that absolutely have a higher purpose, and that is fantastic, and that absolutely helps the consumer buy into them, right? Like whether your innocent smoothies or whatever, like we can all think of them. That's great, but you don't need it, and if you don't have it, don't pretend that you have it, and if you do want it, then be real about how that's going to happen. So for example, a few years ago, we as an agency were like, right, well actually we would like to do something a little bit beyond just simply make profit. So we forged a relationship with a charity called the Turing Trust, and we committed to spending a certain percentage of our time every single month towards helping them. And I'm over the moon. So I think like one of our biggest successes in recent years has been with them. I mean, they've scaled in an insane way. Very quickly, what they do, they take old IT kit. It's run by the family of Alan Turing. They take old IT kit, refurbish it, stick a load of educational software that's not dependent on internet access. That's the critical thing.
Yep.
And then send it out to rural areas in Africa. And they have scaled like mad in the last few years. And I think we've played a really, really important part of that. So don't get me wrong. I think it's great when businesses say, right, how can we do something extra? But I'm not kidding myself. No one's coming to us and like buying our stuff because of like the relationship that we have with the Turing Trust. It's because they've got a problem that needs solving, and that they believe that we're well positioned to help solve that problem. And I just think that until you've defined your core competencies and demonstrated that you can deliver on them 365 days a year, then frankly, who gives a shit like what your lofty, abstract, bullshit, made up vision says on your website?
Yeah, and that's the soundbite, kids.
Sorry.
If there were 3 tidbits or tips you could give someone to develop their personal brand on LinkedIn, what would those be?
I don't know if I'm the best person to say this because I sort of hide behind Mary. Like, I'm not on other social media platforms, right? I'm a very like socially like inept individual. So there's some irony in me answering this question. Having said that, I do spend a lot of time looking at these things, and I think the people who do it brilliantly, they are absolutely themselves. They have a very strong kind of visual identity. I think that's really, really important. I think when you look at the biggest names on LinkedIn, you sort of like, you can kind of picture them before you almost kind of hear their name in your head.
Yep.
I think that's really, really important. Just as a, the kind of aesthetic of any organization's brand is really important. As with any content strategy, it comes back to those principles we spoke about earlier, really committing to that single channel, because there's always a temptation to be like, oh, okay, well, I'm doing this on LinkedIn, so maybe I should also be doing it on TikTok and on YouTube and on Twitter and Instagram and 7 other places. And that's fine. And don't get me wrong, there's a certain operational efficiency to that. By all means, create it here and then, stick it everywhere else. But you have to recognize that every great content strategy, whether it's for an individual or for a business, is invariably defined by one priority platform. And the sooner you identify that platform as an individual, the sooner you can double down on it creatively and with your time. So I think that's super important. And then I think finding something you really enjoy. For me, that was the Mary stuff. For someone else, that could be like, I don't know, like photos of their dog, photos of their holiday. That could be like more serious stuff. It might be telling stories, whatever it is. It's just so important that they enjoy doing it. For a lot of people, it's actually just investing in others. So commenting, and this is true. You go to a networking event, like no one cares about you. They care about how you make them feel and showing an interest in others. So even just, but again, just being deliberate about it. If that's your strategy,
Yep.
Well, actually, like, what does that look like? Are you going to comment 20 times a week? And whatever it is, then just executing relentlessly. As with everything, it's all about execution.
That continual compound effect again, isn't it? That day by day, that small effort will pay off. Because you see people that go through phases on LinkedIn, post a load of stuff, get nowhere, and then they're just quiet, don't post anything again.
Exactly.
And definitely, you see there's people that post all the time, frequently, almost consistently to the minute, and those seem to be the ones that keep showing up in the feed for some reason.
100%. That consistency and being really honest about it. Don't set yourself up for failure. Don't say you're going to do this thing like 3 times a week if it's not going to happen. Like if you think you could do it twice a week, say you'll do it once a week and never ever miss it. Like that consistency is everything.
Definitely. So you've been at the helm of Boss Digital since 2009, going from sort of pure SEO to full service. What was the pivotal moment that made you shift away from purely an SEO focus?
Google always existed to give people the best results from the most trusted brands. It just wasn't terribly good at doing it back when I started. And therefore, there was a certain logic to being very channel-centric, focusing on SEO, basically kind of manipulating the shortcomings of the algorithm to your advantage. That very technical approach, I think, ran its course by about 2011, 2012. And therefore, it really was about how do we solve that problem that Google is trying to solve, which is the best content for the most trusted brands. So that forced us to think much more about the UX, about the content journey on the website, about all the other ways in which you can build a brand, whether that's on social media, PR, whatever that might look like. If I'm honest, it just took us a long time to get there. So we probably identified the need for us to shift, as a lot of SEO agencies probably did about, I think particularly when the big penalties came out, Panda and Penguin was a awful time to be in the SEO. But I think it just took 3, 4, 5 years to really grow up. And we had to hire a number of very experienced strategists from big agencies to come in and teach us how to do this stuff. Because to be frank, none of us, including the kind of senior team, had any of that expertise.
To speak to that, how Google used to be. I remember back when you could effectively just do on-page SEO, get your friend to put a link on their website to your website with the right anchor text, and within 40 hours you were on page 1 of Google.
Honestly, it was the glory days, right? So we would literally, if we had £1,000 budget, it would be like, right, well, we're basically going to buy 1,000 £1 links from our mate Kamlesh. Right? And that is what good SEO looked like. Yeah. And it worked. Empires were built in a matter of months, but then they were destroyed overnight. And it was just a very precarious way to build a living.
Yeah, the old PBN. SEO for us is I sort of naively, when I started the business, thought, we'll just do the same thing, do the technical SEO, get all that bit right. I'm like, cool, and do some links. Yeah, that'll work out great. actually no, we have to do like producing great content all the time, and that's got to be optimized right, and you got to do everything. And it was a quick learning experience for me, because the last time I'd done marketing was when I was running a small business when I was like 15, and that's back at the heyday of Google, and that wasn't the case anymore. And even like paid now in Google is just a minefield. Like you can very quickly set fire in our space anyway. We found you can very quickly almost set fire to money on PPC very easily. What advice would you give other businesses on creating effective lead generation in the B2B space?
The first thing is being about like really clear on a few things. First of all, is that the priority? Because I think very often organizations want to do it all, particularly kind of SMEs. They want to do it all. They want to build a brand. They want to generate leads tomorrow. They want to improve their sales process. They just want everything, and they want it yesterday. So the first thing is about being really clear on the priorities. Also then is about defining what constitutes a lead. There's a real issue with like that old like HubSpot model, where it's like the definition around MQLs and SQLs. I remember when I first came into it and I was told, like by and large, 3 marketing qualified leads should equal 1 sales qualified leads, and 3 sales qualified leads should equal a client. And I was like, that sounds pretty easy. And then pretty quickly I was like, God, am I really bad at this? Or is that just like not true? And it was just such bollocks, right? The average like conversion rate for an MQL like in B2B is like not even like a 0.1%. Like it's so negligible, right? Someone downloading a piece of content on your website does not mean that they're looking to buy. I'm not saying you shouldn't do all those things, but it's about understanding like the reality of the value that they're going to bring. So actually defining what constitutes a high quality lead, which I would say is a lead that's converting at probably like 20-25% plus. And what you might find is that actually this channel over here that doesn't generate you many MQLs, but actually generates you a lot of those leads that are converting at a really, really high rate. So for instance, it might be that you generate, 1,000 leads from, your website downloads every month. But, you're only getting, 1 or 2 clients out the back of that, and maybe they're not really great clients. Conversely, you might be running like small intimate events and you're only getting like a dozen people in the room, but over the course of the next year, half of those are becoming clients and they're your perfect ICPs, etc., etc. So actually defining what you mean by a lead and then doubling down on that activity, I would say is super important. I think being realistic about timeframes, realistic about budgets. Companies always want to spread things too thinly. Do 1 or 2 things really, really well. Like most channels, I would say take at least 20 to 40 hours a month to execute to a reasonable standard, like at least assuming you're not in a super busy space. If you're paying an agency like 50 hours a month and you're asking them to manage like 6 different channels, like it's failed before it's begun. Or if you've got like a team of 2 or 3 people internally and you're asking them to manage 10 different channels, even if they've got the expertise, which they definitely won't have like across all those different disciplines, again, it just isn't going to work. So I think just trying to nail 1 or 2 things and really committing the budget is super important.
Yeah, it's becoming spread too thin, and that's it always makes me laugh. Like when people talk about lead scoring, we've had an inquiry, we better contact them back because they downloaded a white paper. Like no, let's not harass that person. Okay, they start coming back to us, they start downloading more things or joining up to a webinar. Let's send them a nice outreach email, but just because they downloaded a piece of material does not make them an ideal customer.
100% not. And I think there are still like those little tactical things. So for example, I'm going to give a bit of a shout out. Like there's a company called Sopro who do some amazing email marketing.
We work with them.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think they're an example of like, there are still these tactical wins that exist, right, in certain spaces. And there are some things that we do, like I'm a big fan of like handwritten letters and small events and blah, blah, blah. And I think these tactical wins do exist. At any given time, there's like 1 or 2 channels that are really quite exciting. I think events generally, are quite an interesting space at the moment. So I'm not saying that those like big tactical wins don't exist, but I think whatever it is, you've just got to be sensible about the resources that you're committing to things and not expect too much too quickly.
So you mentioned the visceral love of the sale and referenced the scene from Mad Men. In your opinion, what are the timeless elements of sales and marketing that professionals should never lose sight of?
I think it's not a coincidence that most great marketers are good salespeople and that most great marketers are also good copywriters. I think like we become so distracted by the channels nowadays. We forget that ultimately, like if David Ogilvy, like the greatest marketer of all time, if he was brought back to life, I would sooner have him manage my PPC campaign from tomorrow than that random PPC guy over there who's been doing it for the last 10 years, right? And it all comes down to understanding the fundamentals of behavioral psychology, what influences people, and how you use words. Ultimately, that's what it all comes down to, regardless of the medium, to influence that behavior.
And I think this is what, like, a lot of what I hear, read and listen to talks about the sort of like you're right, we're missing the mark. It doesn't really matter where it is. It's all copy, whether that's spoken or written. It's that piece that matters the most. I actually tried to learn some copywriting. I signed up to a service that sent an email every 40 hours or 72 hours. And then the idea is that you write it down and effectively, you learn that style or that to enhance your copywriting. So I wanted to get better at it. I didn't do it, but it made me think about the fact that I should. So your podcast, Boss to Boss, that is a mightily big catalogue of episodes I was flicking through earlier. So it features some remarkable people doing very imaginative things. Could you share a story of a guest that you think embodied the idea of being a game changer?
I'm a really big fan of a guy called Marcus Sheridan, who wrote a book called They Ask You Answer quite a long time ago now, probably 10, 11 years ago.
We're laughing because we've all read the book.
Okay, if your business is interested in performing well in the search engines, don't get me wrong, I don't think you're going to learn a lot about technical SEO or anything like that. But in terms of what we have to constantly remind ourselves, whether you're B2B or consumer, the buyer, if there is a human being involved in the sales process on the business's end, the buyer is going to be 85% of the way through their journey before they want to speak to that human being. That's just because we're so used now to gathering research online. We don't want to be interrupted earlier on. So if they can't arrive at that 85% on your website, they're going to arrive on it on someone else's website. And I think that then also almost like SEO is like a secondary consideration then. But if you nail that and you answer all of those key questions and pain points for your customer, then the rankings are almost going to take care of themselves. And your UX is going to be infinitely better. The conversion rate is going to be better. You're going to disqualify those clients, those prospects that aren't really your perfect customer, etc. So everything is better. I would say Marcus Sheridan's book, They Ask You Answer, I think more and more now, it was years ago that I read it, but I think even though it's quite a simple thing, he really captured the way that things were heading. So that's often now when I'm a big reader, kind of business and marketing books, and I've got a long list that I often recommend to people, and that's usually the one that I in recent times have encouraged people to start with. Also because it's just easy to understand. It's nicely written. It's
a brilliant book that shares that concept. Was it a swimming pool business? I think in the example. Yeah, it's really, really good. And I listened to it. I listened to it a few years ago. And then I was going back through my Audible collection, I'll listen to that again. There might be some good takeaways in that. And I think I came in and was like, you guys need to get this book. And we had a conversation, and then everyone read it after that.
And just such a nice guy, right? I'm not, obviously I'd never name names, but these are incredibly busy, high profile, successful people. And, I've probably done the best part of 1,000 interviews over the years. They say don't meet your heroes, right? I've had a couple of those experiences. Yeah. Marcus Sheridan is just the nicest guy in any room, and that always goes a long way, right?
So how do you go about booking those big guests, Rory Sutherland, for example?
Well, I was saying earlier, I've sort of handed over most of my podcast commitments as a host to other people because I'd taken so much value out of it, so much value, but I didn't necessarily enjoy it as much as I once did. And I think I said this earlier, I think that's super important. As soon as I get on the train this afternoon, the first thing I'll do is write another episode of Mary. I really enjoy it. And I think that's so important when you're going to commit to anything that's going to take years. I'm not really that directly involved anymore, but in terms of historically, there was a time 10 years ago when I first started doing those where it was such a novelty. The idea of B2B influencers didn't really exist. So just simply sending someone an email saying, I love what you're doing, I think you're brilliant, could I borrow half an hour of your time? That was enough. That changed, obviously. Now it's super busy and you have to, I think, really invest in the person. So for example, with Rory Sutherland, I'd read his book. I thought it was absolutely amazing. I'd watched him at a talk, and I think the opening line of my email to him was along the lines of, I'm currently on page 323 of your book. I've just, blah, blah, blah. I think this is absolutely fantastic. He replied in about 5 minutes, and I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Yeah. And again, just what an incredibly nice man. It doesn't always work, but I think it's pretty obvious to people whether or not you've really invested in them. And I think nowadays, because it's so saturated now, I think you really have to.
Yeah, it makes a massive difference. That personal touch and standing out from the noise in terms of what a nice thing to get. Someone's literally in the middle of reading your book and wants to invite you onto their podcast. That's more, you're going to be more inclined now, aren't you, to say, yes, actually, I'd love to come on because they've taken the time to understand you.
Yeah.
In terms of the podcast itself, do you think it's helped you with growing and developing your business in any way?
I think if I have any good ideas, they're basically good ideas that I've robbed from other people, and most of those people have probably appeared on one of the podcasts over the years. There's an intensity about that environment where you are listening so proactively, and often I used to do written-based interviews when we first started, like 8-10 years ago. So like Rory Sutherland's was like a written interview. Now, writing the interview, trying to capture the tone and message of the chairman of Rolls-Royce of like agency world, right? Ogilvy. Yeah. That's a fairly daunting task, right? So I spent an insane number of hours writing that, editing that, etc. By the time I sent it to Rory for approval, and again, he replied in a second, just being like, yeah, it was great. I just felt like I had grasped the concepts that he had been communicating for the last few years via his books and talks and everything else. I just felt like I understood him to such like an extent that I think you don't necessarily get when you're just reading a book or just following someone on LinkedIn or whatever. So I think the amount that I've learned from those hundreds of podcasts has been unbelievably valuable to me. There's also just the fact that, it can be a great door opener, and you meet some brilliant people, and brilliant people tend to know brilliant people, so they can open the next door. I've seen more so clients use it as a really strategic business development tool to great effect.
Yeah, we spoke about this in terms of how do you book guests on the podcast? How do you use it to leverage it for the business? But I think that you said before about enjoyment, and that's a big thing for me. Like when I come to work every day, I want to enjoy it. So I want to be doing things that I enjoy. It's a bit like a lot of stuff we've done on YouTube. We do it because we enjoy it. Like we did a video recently. It was a bit daft. It was like calling out some of the comments on a video that we'd had where we were getting some negative exposure. And we put it out there because we enjoyed this sort of response video. It was a bit daft, but I think it just shows off the personality and keeps 100%. It enjoyable every day at work. Yep. Where's Mary going next? What's in store?
I've had several people email me recently, about helping me turn it into either a book or like an animated thing, which I think is massively getting ahead of itself, right? I probably will print it out into some form of little book at some point, just because in a world of digital saturation. I'm a big believer that often it's the traditional, tangible, methods that really kind of cut through. So I think that would just be really fun to kind of print it out and send it around to a couple hundred people or whatever. There is a temptation to try and work out how to turn it into short form video, because obviously there's everything algorithmically and in terms of what engages people, there's such a focus on short form video now. But I think again, it's very easy to get distracted with these things and kind of carried away. And as I said, it's 9 months in on an 18-month kind of runway. Yep. So I just want to double down on what seems to be kind of working quite well at the moment.
Absolutely. Just keep repeating the process and build upon it. Yep. So last question. Considering the theme of the podcast, which is the game changers, what would you ask our next guest?
Wow. Can I know who your next guest is?